is our very own Duns Ford himself, announcing that he'll be giving 100,000 asylum seekers in Ontario work permits, completely avoiding eligible Canadians that could do the same job.
Disrupt America that I fought for.
Weird thing to happen. Things aren't looking promising, folks. And for the Canadian economy, things are not turning for the best. So, as Blender News reports, Canada facing an economic crossroads. Unemployment rate rose to 6.9%. That's now over 7, by the way. So this is a little while back, but it's now over 7. 15.4% of those unemployed are young men are jobless. Women 25 to 54 lost 60,000 jobs in April. 3.6 thousand manufacturing jobs vanished. 26.8 thousand retail jobs are disappearing. Canada's future hinges on our next steps. So here's a bit of a breakdown that they put together. This is back from May, but it really highlights how downturning we're turning ourselves over in further demise of this country. But watch.
Canada's unemployment rate has jumped to 6.9%. 15.4% of young men are unemployed. Women aged 25 to 54 lost 60,000 full-time jobs in April alone. 30,600 manufacturing jobs and 26,800 retail jobs are gone. Ontario's auto industry, which includes 144,000 jobs, are on the edge, while our GDP per capita continues to fall. A GDP per capita that has been declining at an annual rate of 0.4%, marking the worst economic performance among 50 developed nations.
But the good news is, according to schmucks at like the Globe and Mail, that tell you, hey, Canada doesn't need an auto sector. We can just make bombs to go kill people. That's literally what they suggest. Hey, cars are pretty much dead anyway, so why don't we just make ammunition to sell to other countries so that we can go around bombing and detonating other parts of the world and turn them even shittier. That's coming from the peacekeeping nation of Canada. Another kind of embarrassment of being part of this nation. That we're supposed to be a peacekeeping nation. We're supposed to be diverse. We're supposed to care for each other. We're supposed to be the loving, kind, neighbors of the North. What happened to that?
And what's the federal government's solution? Well, they skewed the data by adding 37,000 temporary jobs in the public sector. Without these temporary government hires, April's unemployment numbers would have been catastrophic. Since 2015, the public sector has added over 110,000 new jobs, increasing the federal workforce by 43%, while the private sector suffers a death from 1,000 cuts. However, when your public sector grows but your private sector continues to shrink, there's nobody left to pay the bills. Economist Jack Mintz calls this just the start of Canada's manufacturing erosion, blaming Trump's trade war as the culprit, but tariffs aren't the full story. The real problem here is Canada's vulnerability, created by years of bloated government, stifled industry, socialist economics, and blind faith in the US market. We're watching a private sector collapse in real time, while the government clings to Keynesian ideology and an ever-increasing payroll. But there is a way out, and no, it's not more government intervention. We need to leverage Canada's natural resources by streamlining approvals and fast-tracking exports to Asia, Europe, and India. If Alberta's oil and Quebec's critical minerals are leveraged effectively, we will not replace the US, but we will end our dependency on it. We need to cut taxes and deregulate markets to create conditions for private investment and to empower entrepreneurs so that they build instead of begging for a lifeline. We need to unleash AI in manufacturing and allow private firms to automate and compete globally by killing all the red tape and letting innovation lead. And we need to launch serious trade missions to diversify. Japan, South Korea, and the EU are all open to Canadian goods if we would just show up with something to sell. Clearly, Canada stands at a crossroads. The private sector is collapsing, and the temporary government jobs won't save us. We have the talent, and we have the resources, but we need leaders who choose markets over ideology. So it's time for citizens to demand accountability from their MPs because regardless of the party that won, your MPs work for you. We need to flood their inboxes, fill their voicemails, and show up at their offices. We need to push for policies that prioritize long-term prosperity over short-term optics because we're going downhill fast. And if we don't do something very soon, I'm not sure what will be left after the next 4 years. Yes, Canada will be here, but will you have a job? Will the government own your home? Will the average family be dependent on the government? Will your streets be any safer? And will free speech cost so much that you self censor just to stay out of trouble? I mean, this might sound hyperbolic, but these things are either already happening or they're next in line on the liberal agenda. So this can't be where we give up. We have a civic duty to hold our elected representatives accountable to do what's right for this country. Sure, it may be a little harder based on how the election turned out, but again, we have power in numbers. The talent is here, the resources are here, all that's missing is the will. So the question is, will we let our government continue to take our country down the wrong path, or will we make them correct course through collective action? Either way, Canada's future depends on what we do next.
So I agree with the sentiment there. I agree with a lot of the statements there that, we're very resource rich and we need to utilize it to the best case scenario. And we got to invest more into our manufacturing, invest more into farming, invest more into our oil sectors. I agree with that. I agree with that. The problem, the contemplating thing about this is you got to be careful what you wish for when you say that you want to transfer the power to the private sector, because the private sector is no better than the public sector in a lot of cases. So taking a look at this, more, regional area. So looking at Ontario here, Ontario lost 28,000 jobs in March, marking first significant rise in unemployment rate since 2023. During periods of economic downturns, workers may become more likely to be laid off, which can increase the overall unemployment rate, Statistics Canada said. So this is back in April when they wrote this article. And what we're experiencing right now going into our summer months is one of the highest youth unemployments in the country's history. What we're experiencing is a huge economic downturn, not only because of the insidiousness of the government, the lack of, resource development, the fact that they're wasting away billions and trillions of dollars to overseas projects to the benefit of their tune and their donors' tune and not investing into our country, but also because the private sector, a lot of these companies are restructuring. They're taking the Doge measure into cutting back their labor costs, and they're tricking down and disrupting the labor market by claiming that there's not enough people to work in certain areas, while begging the government to fast track and approve migrant workers. So here, for example, is our very own Duns Ford himself, announcing that he'll be giving 100,000 asylum seekers in Ontario work permits. So while unemployment is skyrocketing in just one province, is skyrocketing across the nation, but here in Ontario, it's skyrocketing, where youth unemployment's the highest it's ever been. He's now granting these private companies the ability to hire and exploit temporary foreign workers, more so. And as I stated before, I have no problem with immigration if it's legal and people looking to work in this country and go through the same legal checkpoints that many other people have gone through to immigrate into this country. I have no problem with that. And I almost feel bad for the migrants themselves because of how they're being abused in this system. We're being abused by having our jobs being castrated and gutting out the labor sector in this country to look for cheaper alternatives like exploiting illegal migrants, because you don't have to pay them a decent salary. You don't have to worry about union benefits or anything like that. So that disrupts the whole measure of the labor force here in this country. You need a strong labor force in order to have a great economy. And this is just another way that politicians are exploiting that, exploiting the workforce, exploiting Canadians in this process, which is not going to benefit the economy one bit. And here is Doug Ford announcing this to Ontarians.
I have a tremendous amount of asylum seekers that are up in Etobicoke and in the hotels. They're healthy, they're willing to work, they're hardworking people, but they're waiting over 2 years. And they're just sucking off the system nonstop, not their fault. The fault falls under immigration, that it takes over 2 years to get a work permit. So as we're paying education, paying healthcare, paying the rent and hotels, which is exorbitant.
So his claim is because they have to wait for a work permit to get a migrant worker to work at these facilities, that's why they're fast tracking, completely avoiding eligible Canadians that could do the same job. And it's not because people are lazy or the generation's getting soft or no one wants to work or any of that garbage. That's all propaganda, because the companies, the private firms, they're the ones undermining the workforce here in Canada. Canadians are willing to work. They're willing to work for a decent pay. If you pay someone a decent amount for their work, they will do anything. People will do anything. Remember the show that Mike Rowe did on Discovery, Dirty Jobs? People will do anything if you pay them a decent wage. If you treat them like an actual person and not a slave, not a servant to serve the needs of a CEO or a top billionaire that barely moves a muscle. If you pay someone a decent wage, they will do anything. But this is how private companies, along with the government, in cooperation with each other, to facilitate the undermining of the workforce here in Canada and exploiting people weaker on the economic ladder. That's why I don't put the blame on migrants. I don't say that migrants are stealing jobs, because that's, again, another propaganda technique, is for us to point the finger at newcomers, at people coming into this country. Well, we wouldn't have this problem if A, Canadian companies actually hired Canadians and gave them a decent chance and wage and salary. And two, we wouldn't have this flooding of the situation if our policies reflected on understanding, respect, and legality of immigration. If we didn't have open borders. Also, if we didn't bomb these countries, we wouldn't have the flooding of asylum seekers. How about stop doing that? Because people don't want to leave their livelihoods and go to a totally new place where they already feel the burden of unacceptance. That's a fact. People don't want to leave their livelihoods from different country to come here and be an exploit in this measure. So what Doug Ford is doing is completely delegitimizing his own economy. He's completely corrupting his own economy because his donors that are complaining that they have to wait a certain time period to get these migrants, he wants to fast track instead of hiring Canadians. So this is all part of the exploitation. This is all part of the exploitation that so many premiers, that so many legislators, that so many politicians in coordinates with private companies and equity firms and their donors all contribute to this. This is all part of the scam. Here's CBC News reporting, from fast food to construction, employers turn more and more to temporary foreign workers. Approvals through the temporary foreign worker program rise in a variety of sectors, analysts show. So the whole purpose of why companies would hire a temporary foreign worker is either they're short-staffed people, they can't hire people, So they resort to a temporary foreign worker to fill a position. And they have to go through, again, legal checkpoints, the same way someone coming into this country has to go through legal checkpoints to make sure they are valid to have a temporary foreign worker work in this position. They have to make sure that whatever company can't actually hire a Canadian for that position. But a lot of companies use fraudulent claims to get temporary foreign workers. Why? Because then you don't have to pay them a decent wage. You can undermine the possibility of unionization. You can undermine people getting benefits the more temporary foreign workers you incorporate. So this is all part of the greater exploitation. And some people will say, well, why? Why would companies go through the turmoil and paperwork and hassle of getting temporary foreign workers when they can just get a Canadian off the street and not go through those legal challenges? Well, as we've already shown, and we've shown this numerous times before, the Canadian government subsidizes this scam. And that's why businesses and corporations like Tim Hortons, for example, that's a very unique Canadian icon, a Canadian institution, your local coffee chain, are purposely undermining Canadians and hiring migrant workers. They're purposely doing that because their parent company, Restaurant Brands International, that runs out of Brazil, out of all places, are telling Tim Hortons, Burger King, fast food joints to cut back on their labor and hire migrants. They're doing this purposely, and more so because the Canadian government pays those companies to do so. So they make fraudulent claims that there's not enough Canadians to work these positions, even though unemployment is skyrocketing and people will work for anything if you give them a decent wage and treat them with respect. We know that. But they do it intentionally because they know they're going to get a kickback from the government. And here's Mario Naffel stating, we showed this video before, a convenience store owner claimed he's paid to hire Indian workers literally thanks to 30% kickbacks from the government. So notice how Doug Ford will never touch this issue. Notice how no politician will ever touch this issue. And if you actually stop these cutbacks and you actually go into the companies and investigate why they're not hiring Canadians, that would actually go and help people with the unemployment numbers. That would actually do something for the economy. Just like how in America, all the ICE raids that are happening in like California, for example, when they storm in Home Depots, they're not going after the companies. They're not going after the companies that hired the migrants in the first place. They're going after them themselves, which is another point of this whole scam. It's a scam. It's a whole scheme designed by the elite class, by the billionaires, incorporating with the government to push this upon people, to deliberately go after the labor force of countries, put in a bunch of migrants, exploiting them to the point that, hey, even if we took away the migrants, AI is skyrocketing and they're going to take your job. So let me just show once again why exactly Canada is clearly sacrificing itself and killing its own economy in this way.
The kids today they're struggling. The 20-year-olds, there's no jobs for them out there.
Who gets all the jobs?
The migrants. The companies get to hire the migrants. When they hire them, they pay them less. Okay? And also, they could get kickbacks from the government. I own a convenience store, for instance.
So that's why a company will deliberately undermine Canadians to hire a migrant. And that's why they support open borders. That's why they support the increasing of migrant flow. That's why they support someone like Doug Ford that's allowing a full fast track of work visas while unemployment is skyrocketing, while 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, people within this country from coast to coast are struggling to find a job. It's not because no one wants to work. Not because language shortages. It's because of this scheme. It's because of this scheme. They get to pay them less, and they also get subsidies from the government. So why wouldn't a company go down this track? Why wouldn't any company want to do this?
I hire you, you're from India. Then I get an MLR9, I get to hire you, and basically what happens is I pay you $20 an hour. The government every 3 months gives me a 30% kickback. I was in Prince George, my hometown. The people at the movie theater, the lady was telling me she doesn't want to work here anymore because everyone she works with is Indian and they all speak Punjab. So she goes to work. She's a Canadian kid that grew up in a small conservative town that can't work in a place because no one that she works with actually speaks English, because they come here and they don't speak English either. If you were that person that owned the movie theater and your cost of doing business were, 30% went straight into just hiring the kids, hiring employees. Now, if that 30% now to pay 60% of that 30% because you got that all back, you're going to make more money. So what do people do? They take care of themselves and their family. So they will hire those people because their family is going to get rewarded as a result.
So, there you go. The best way we can actually resolve the economic woes and the unemployment is to actually stop this scheme. Stop this entire scheme. Go after the companies, not the people. Like I said, I have no problems with newcomers and, migrants that came in legally. If they're looking for work and they're willing to go through the legal loopholes to become a registered worker in this country, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with that because they're no different than you or I. They're no different than anyone else trying to survive in this crazy world. But companies that are purposely exploiting and undermining the entire workforce of this country, undermining Canadians, and crippling their own economy by doing this is a master scheme to completely dismantle the entire working class of this country. They're doing this in Canada. They're doing this in European nations. They're doing this in America. What do you think the ICE raids are about? We were told that they're only going after the illegals. But guess what? They're storing people at Home Depot and Walmart. Why? Because God forbid they're working. God forbid they're working. And God forbid ICE does a raid at the, Walton family house that are purposely exploiting those migrant workers and exploiting Americans and shunning them out of a job. God forbid we ever crack down on them. God forbid we ever stop this scheme, this corrupted scheme that is sacrificing the entire nation and sacrificing our economy for a couple of bucks that companies can, pocket off of not paying a decent wage to a migrant and they get 30% kickbacks. Is that really worth it to sacrifice the entire country? Is that worth it? Is that worth it to call yourself a Canadian institution and barging Canadians from actually working? Is it actually worth it? The billionaires will say yes, because they don't subscribe to any country whatsoever. Like the movie Network. Just companies and the international flow of dollars. They don't believe in countries. They don't believe in, doing due process for the good of the people.